Tonight, we explore a moment that no one witnessed. A moment that passed quietly, without record, without memory, without even the possibility of being remembered in the way we understand history today. There were no written accounts, no symbols carved into stone, no stories preserved through generations. Because this moment happened long before any of those things existed. It took place in a world where humans had not yet learned to write, had not yet learned to record, and most importantly, had not yet learned to speak. It was a moment so small, so subtle, that it would have gone completely unnoticed by those living within it. And yet, it would become one of the most powerful turning points in the entire history of our species. The first time a human spoke. Not the sounds of fear that echoed through the night. Not the cries of pain that came instinctively in moments of danger. Not the simple calls and vocal signals shared with other animals. But something entirely new. Something intentional. A sound created not just as a reaction, but as an expression. A sound that carried meaning. A voice that began to shape thought. A moment when silence, which had surrounded humanity for countless generations, began to slowly break apart. And in that quiet shift, language was born. It did not arrive suddenly. There was no single instant where silence turned completely into speech. Instead, it was a gradual transformation, a slow awakening, a change so delicate that it likely went unnoticed by those experiencing it. But over time, it would reshape everything. How did it happen? How did humans move from simple, instinctive sounds to the complex systems of speech we use today? How did they go from gestures and expressions to stories, ideas, and shared knowledge? How did humanity cross that invisible boundary between silence and the endless conversations that now fill our world? To understand this, we must travel back, far beyond the rise of the first cities, far beyond the invention of tools and organized communities, back into a time when humans were still discovering what it meant to think and what it meant to share those thoughts with others. Imagine a world where no one has ever spoken a word, a world where thoughts exist only within the mind, where ideas cannot be fully explained, only hinted at through movement, sound, and expression. Early humans lived in such a world. They were not silent in the way we might imagine. They made sounds. They called out to one another. They reacted to danger, to pain, to excitement. But these sounds were limited. They lacked structure. They lacked consistency. They lacked the ability to carry complex meaning. A gesture might indicate direction. A cry might signal danger. A look might express emotion. But deeper thoughts, more detailed ideas, remain trapped inside each individual mind. Imagine wanting to explain something important. A place far away filled with food. A memory of danger from days before. A plan for what might happen tomorrow. Without language, these ideas are difficult to share. You might try to show. You might try to imitate. You might point, repeat, or act things out. But the full meaning, the complete thought, remains just out of reach. And yet, inside these early humans, something remarkable was already developing. Their minds were growing more complex. They could remember the past. They could anticipate the future. They could imagine things that were not immediately present. Thoughts were becoming richer, deeper, more detailed. But without language, these thoughts existed in isolation, each mind alone with its own ideas, waiting for a way to connect. And slowly, over thousands of years, something began to change. Small shifts in sound, repeated patterns, certain vocal expressions that began to carry shared meaning. Not yet full words, not yet structured language, but something new, a beginning, a fragile bridge between one mind and another. And in that quiet beginning, something extraordinary was taking shape. The foundation of language, the ability to turn thought into sound, and sound into understanding. So tonight, as you relax and let your mind drift, imagine that distant world. A world before words, before names, before stories. A world where silence was not empty, but full of thoughts waiting to be spoken. And somewhere in that ancient past, one human made a sound, and another understood. And in that simple moment, the long journey of language began. Imagine waking up in a world where language does not exist. There are no names to call out, no sentences to form, no conversations waiting to unfold. The silence is not empty, but different. It is filled with sound, yet without words. You open your eyes as the first light of morning spreads across the land. The air is cool, and the world feels alive in a quiet, steady way. You hear the wind moving gently through the trees, rustling leaves in soft, repeating patterns. Nearby, water flows across stone, creating a constant, soothing rhythm as it moves through the landscape. Footsteps press lightly against dry earth as others in your group begin to stir and move. And then there are the voices of humans. But they are not voices as we know them. They are not shaped into words or sentences. They do not carry stories or explanations. They are sounds, raw, natural, instinctive. A short call, a sudden cry, a low murmur. Each sound has meaning, but only in the simplest sense. Early humans did not begin with language as we understand it today. There were no structured systems of speech, no shared vocabulary, no grammar. Instead, communication existed in forms that were far simpler and yet deeply important for survival. A raised hand could signal danger. A sudden, sharp cry could warn others of a predator moving nearby. A quick movement of the body could tell someone to stop, to follow, or to hide. A glance, brief and intentional, could communicate awareness, concern, or attention. In this world, meaning did not live in words. It lived in action, in movement, in expression. Every gesture carried weight. Every sound had purpose. These early forms of communication were enough, at least for a time. They allowed humans to survive in a dangerous and unpredictable environment. If a predator appeared, a single sound could alert the group. If food was found nearby, a gesture could guide others to it. If something required immediate attention, a movement or call could bring people together. For basic survival, this system worked. But it had its limits. You could warn someone about danger that was right in front of them. But how would you describe a threat that existed far away, beyond sight? How would you explain that a certain place, miles from where you stand, holds both food and danger? You could point in a direction. You could repeat certain sounds. You might even try to act out what you had seen. But the message would remain incomplete. Something would always be missing. You could signal hunger with a sound or gesture. Others might understand that you need food. But how could you explain a plan to find it? How could you suggest traveling to a specific place tomorrow? How could you organize a group effort with roles and timing and intention? Without language, such ideas are difficult to share. You could express fear easily. A sudden cry, a change in posture, a look of alarm, all of these would be understood immediately. But telling a story is something else entirely. A story requires sequence. It requires detail. It requires the ability to describe something that is no longer happening or has not yet happened. In a world without language, stories remain locked inside the mind. Imagine witnessing something extraordinary. Perhaps you see a large herd of animals moving through a distant valley. You want to share this discovery. You want others to understand where it is, how far away it lies, and why it matters. But without words, your ability to explain is limited. You might point. You might make sounds. You might try to guide them physically. But the full picture, the complete idea, cannot be fully expressed. And so, much of what you know stays within you. Unspoken, unshared. This was the reality for early humans. Their world was filled with thoughts, rich thoughts, detailed observations, memories of places, events, and experiences. Their minds were already capable of far more than their communication allowed. They could remember the past. They could imagine possibilities. They could learn from experience. But without language, these thoughts were isolated. Each person carried their own understanding of the world, alone. Waiting for a way to reach beyond the boundaries of their own mind. Waiting for a way to connect those thoughts with others. And slowly, over many generations, that change would begin. But for now, in this quiet world before words, meaning lived in silence, in movement, and in the simple sounds that echoed softly through the ancient landscape. A world where every thought longed for a voice, and every voice was still searching for its first true word. For hundreds of thousands of years, the human brain was changing. Slowly, quietly, almost invisibly across generations. It was growing in complexity, becoming more capable, more flexible, more aware of the world around it. These changes did not happen in a single lifetime. No individual human would have noticed the difference. But over vast stretches of time, something remarkable was unfolding inside the minds of our early ancestors. Their ability to remember was becoming stronger. They could recall places they had visited before, rivers that flowed through valleys, trees that bore fruit in certain seasons, paths that led to safety or danger. Memory became a tool for survival, not just reacting to the present moment, but learning from the past. They could also plan, not in the detailed, structured way we do today, but in simple and meaningful ways. They could think ahead. If food was scarce in one area, they might begin to move toward another place where they remembered finding resources before. If the weather began to change, they could prepare by seeking shelter or adjusting their movements. This ability to plan, even in its early form, marked an important shift in human thinking. And perhaps most importantly, they could imagine. They could picture things that were not directly in front of them. A distant location, a future event, a memory replayed in the mind. Imagination allowed early humans to go beyond the immediate world of sight and sound. It allowed them to carry experiences within them, to reflect, to anticipate, to wonder. And yet, despite these growing abilities, there was a limitation, a barrier that had not yet been crossed. Without language, these thoughts remained isolated, each mind alone. Imagine carrying a thought that you cannot fully share, a memory you cannot describe, an idea you cannot explain. You can feel it clearly within yourself, but when you try to express it, something is missing. This was the reality for early humans. Their minds were becoming richer, more detailed, more capable of understanding the world. But their ability to communicate those thoughts had not yet caught up. Now imagine seeing something extraordinary. You are walking across the land when you come upon a distant valley. From a high point, you look down and see movement below. A large group of animals, more than you have seen in a long time. The valley is filled with life. It is a place rich with food, a place that could sustain your group for days, perhaps longer. You understand the importance of what you have seen. You feel the urgency to share it, to tell others, to guide them there. But when you return to your group, you face a challenge. Without language, how do you explain it? You might point in the direction of the valley. You might use your hands to imitate the shapes or movements of the animals. You might make sounds to represent what you saw. Perhaps you repeat these actions again and again, hoping others will understand. And they might understand something. They might sense that there is food somewhere, that there is something worth seeing. But the full idea, the complete picture, remains just out of reach. You cannot easily explain distance. You cannot describe how many animals there are. You cannot communicate the exact location or the best path to reach it. The richness of your thought is reduced to fragments, pieces of meaning, incomplete and uncertain. This limitation shaped the world of early humans. It slowed the sharing of knowledge. It made cooperation more difficult. It placed boundaries on what could be taught and learned. Language would change all of this, but it did not appear suddenly. There was no single moment when humans woke up and began speaking in full sentences. Instead, language emerged slowly, gradually, across thousands of generations. Small changes built upon other small changes. A sound repeated more consistently. A gesture paired with a specific meaning. A shared understanding that grew stronger over time. Each generation added something new, even if they did not realize it. A slightly clearer sound. A more consistent signal. A stronger connection between thought and expression. Over time, these small steps began to form something larger. A system. A way to connect one mind to another. A way to take a thought that existed silently inside the brain and give it form. To give it sound. And eventually, to give it meaning that others could fully understand. This transformation did not happen quickly. It unfolded slowly, patiently, over immense stretches of time. But once it began, it would never stop. Because the human mind had already grown ready for it. All it needed was a way to speak. At some point in this long, quiet stretch of human history, something began to shift. It was not a dramatic change. There was no sudden moment when everything became different. No clear boundary between silence and speech. Instead, it was subtle, almost invisible. A slow transformation unfolding across generations. The sounds humans made, once instinctive and unstructured, began to change. They became more consistent, more deliberate. Certain vocal patterns started to repeat. The same sound used again and again in similar situations. A sound for danger. A sharp, urgent call that caused others to stop, to look, to become alert. A sound for food. Softer perhaps, but filled with intention, something that drew others closer, signaling discovery or opportunity. A sound for gathering. A call that brought the group together, not through panic, but through shared purpose. At first, these were not words in the way we understand them today. There was no grammar, no sentences, no complex structure. They were simple vocal signals. Short sounds, instinctive, yet becoming increasingly controlled. But they carried something new. They carried meaning. And meaning is where language begins. Imagine a small group of humans gathered together in an open landscape. Perhaps they are resting or quietly moving through the land. The air is still. The group is calm. Then suddenly, one individual notices something in the distance. A movement, a shape, perhaps an animal grazing far across the plain. In the past, this person might have pointed, raised a hand, moved their body to draw attention. But now, something slightly different happens. They make a sound, a specific sound, not random, not entirely instinctive, but chosen, repeated, recognizable. The others turn their heads. They hear the sound, and something inside them connects it to meaning. They understand, in a simple way, what is being communicated. Not fully, not perfectly, but enough. Enough to react. Enough to look in the same direction. Enough to begin moving together. This moment is small. It would have seemed ordinary to those experiencing it. But within it, something important is taking place. A connection between sound and idea. A bridge between one mind and another. Over time, this process repeats. Again and again. In different situations. With different sounds. A sound used in one moment begins to appear in another. It becomes familiar. Recognizable. The group begins to expect it. To understand it more quickly. To respond to it more naturally. And slowly, very slowly, that sound becomes associated with a specific idea. Not just a reaction, but a representation. A symbol carried by the voice. This is how meaning begins to take shape in sound. And as these associations grow stronger, something new begins to form. A shared understanding. A system. Not written. Not formally created. But built through repetition, memory, and experience. Each member of the group contributes to it, even without realizing. Each time a sound is used and understood, the connection becomes stronger. Each time it is repeated, it becomes clearer. Over generations, these patterns grow more stable, more refined, more flexible. What begins as a simple signal gradually evolves into something more complex, more expressive. This is how language may have begun, not as a sudden invention created in a single moment of insight, not as a tool deliberately designed, but as a gradual agreement, a shared system that emerged naturally from the need to communicate, a system shaped by countless small interactions, moments where one human made a sound and another understood, moments where meaning passed between minds, not through gesture alone, but through voice. These early sounds were deeply connected to the world around them, to animals, to food, to danger, to movement, to the immediate needs of survival. They did not yet describe abstract ideas or distant thoughts. They were grounded in the present moment, in what could be seen, heard, and experienced. But they marked the beginning of something far greater. Because once a sound could carry meaning, it could evolve, it could expand, it could combine with other sounds. It could begin to describe more than just the immediate world. And from this simple foundation, built slowly over time, the long journey of language began. A journey that would eventually lead to stories, to ideas, to knowledge passed across generations, to the countless words spoken every day in the world we know now. But it all began here, with simple sounds, repeated, recognized, a quiet agreement between humans that a sound could mean something, and that meaning could be understood. Before words became fully developed, before human voices learned to shape complex sounds into structured speech, the human body itself played a powerful and essential role in communication. Long before language was spoken, it was shown, expressed through movement, through posture, through the subtle and constant motion of the hands, the face, and the eyes. In this early world, communication did not depend on words. It lived in the body. Hands moved constantly, not randomly, but with intention. A simple motion could carry meaning. A hand raised quickly might signal danger. A sharp, controlled gesture could tell someone to stop, to stay still, to be alert. A slower, guiding motion might invite others to follow, to come closer, to move in a certain direction. These gestures were immediate, visible, clear in ways that sound alone could not always achieve. Faces, too, played a powerful role. Expressions communicated emotion long before words could describe it. A widened gaze could signal fear or surprise. A tightening of the face could show tension or warning. A relaxed expression might communicate calm or safety. Even the smallest changes in the face could carry meaning that others learned to recognize over time. A look could warn. A quick glance toward a distant point could draw attention to something important. A sustained stare could signal caution or focus. A smile, simple and natural, could reassure others, creating a sense of connection and trust within the group. These expressions formed a silent language, one that did not require sound, but was deeply understood. The body became a tool for sharing thought and feeling. A raised arm could command attention. It could bring the group to stillness. It could direct awareness towards something unseen by others. In a world filled with potential danger, such signals were not just useful, they were essential. Communication needed to be fast, reliable, and often silent. Sound could travel far, sometimes too far. A loud call might alert not only other humans, but predators as well. Gestures, by contrast, could be seen without being heard. They allowed communication to remain controlled and contained within the group. For this reason, many scientists believe that human language may have begun not with the voice, but with the body, as a form of gesture-based communication. Long before structured speech emerged, humans may have relied heavily on movement to express meaning. Hands may have spoken before voices did. A system of shared gestures, developed gradually over time, could have formed the foundation of early communication. These gestures would have been learned through observation, repeated, refined, passed from one individual to another, from one generation to the next. Over time, they may have become more precise, more consistent, more capable of expressing not just immediate reactions, but more complex ideas. This silent language of the body allowed early humans to coordinate actions, to share awareness, to connect with one another in ways that went beyond simple instinct. And even today, traces of this ancient system remain within us. We still point, without thinking, without needing to explain. A simple movement of the hand can direct someone's attention instantly. We still signal, a wave to greet, a gesture to stop, a motion to guide. These actions are understood across cultures, often without the need for words. We still express ourselves through movement as much as through speech. Our hands move when we talk. Our faces shift with emotion. Our posture reflects how we feel, often without our awareness. These are not new behaviors. They are echoes of something far older, remnants of a time when communication depended entirely on the body. Language, in its earliest form, may not have been purely spoken. It may have been a blend, a combination of sound and motion, voice and gesture working together, supporting each other, strengthening meaning. A sound might draw attention, a gesture might clarify it, a movement might complete the idea. Together, they formed a more complete system of communication than either could achieve alone. Over time, as human voices became more flexible and capable, sound may have taken on a greater role. But it did not replace gesture entirely. Instead, the two systems continued to work together. Even now, when we speak, our bodies still move. Our hands still shape meaning. Our expressions still carry emotion. Because communication was never only about words. It was always about connection, about sharing thought and feeling from one mind to another. And in those distant times, before words fully existed, it was the human body that carried that connection. Quietly, powerfully, and with a language all its own. As time passed, something subtle yet extraordinary began to take shape within the human body. The voice, once limited, instinctive, and unrefined, started to change. Not suddenly, and not in a way that could be noticed in a single lifetime, but slowly across countless generations. Human voices became more flexible. The physical structures that produce sound, the throat, the tongue, the lips, and the mouth, gradually evolved, allowing for a wider and more controlled range of vocal expressions. The tongue became more agile, capable of shaping airflow into different forms. The lips could open, close, and shift in ways that altered sound. The throat, including the vocal cords, became more refined in its ability to produce varied tones and pitches. Even breathing itself began to change. Early humans learned, over time, to control their breath more precisely. Instead of short, instinctive bursts of sound, they could sustain longer vocalizations. They could hold a sound, extend it, shape it. This control over breath was essential. It allowed sounds to become more stable, more deliberate, more capable of carrying meaning. And gradually, those simple, instinctive sounds began to change. They became more structured. Not random bursts of noise, but patterns that could be repeated, recognized. A sound used once could be used again. And when it was repeated in the same situation, it began to form a connection, a link between sound and meaning. Over time, these sounds became more precise. Slight variations began to matter. A small change in tone or rhythm could create a different meaning. The human voice was no longer just reacting to the world. It was beginning to describe it. These sounds also became more repeatable. This was one of the most important changes. A sound that could be produced the same way, again and again, could be remembered. It could be learned. It could be passed from one person to another. And with repetition came understanding, a shared recognition. At some point in this long and gradual process, something remarkable happened. A sound was no longer just a sound. It was no longer simply a reaction to a moment. It became something more. It became a word, a consistent sound that carried a specific meaning. A sound that, when heard, would always point to the same idea. This was a profound shift, because once a sound becomes a word, it can be used intentionally. It can be chosen. It can be shared with clarity. It becomes a tool of thought, not just a reflection of it. The first words were likely simple, connected to the most essential parts of survival. Perhaps a sound for food, a way to call others when something edible was found. A sound for water, something that guided others toward life-sustaining sources. A sound for danger, a warning that could be understood instantly even before a threat was seen. These early words would have been deeply tied to the immediate world, to what could be seen, touched, and experienced. But language did not stop there. Over time, words may have begun to take on more personal meaning. And perhaps one of the most powerful developments of all was the creation of names. The first time one human used a specific sound to refer to another individual, something profound had changed. Before this, humans may have recognized one another through sight, through familiarity, through presence. But now, there was a sound that could represent a person, a sound that could call them even from a distance, a sound that belonged to them, a name. This was more than just a new type of word. It was the beginning of identity within communication. A person was no longer just someone seen or known. They could be called, recognized through sound, separated from others by a unique expression. A name allowed for deeper connection. It allowed one person to address another directly, to call for help, to give instruction, to share something specific. It also allowed memory to take on a new form. A person could be remembered not just as a face or a presence, but as a sound, a name that carried their identity beyond the moment. In this way, language began to move beyond the immediate world. It began to shape relationships, to define individuals, to create a shared understanding not just of objects and dangers, but of people themselves. And all of this emerged slowly, step by step, sound by sound, from simple vocal expressions to structured, meaningful words, from instinct to intention, from noise to language, a quiet transformation unfolding across thousands of generations, until one day a human voice spoke a sound, and that sound did not fade into the air. It stayed, recognized, understood, remembered, a word, and with it, the beginning of a new way of being human. Once words existed, even in their simplest and most fragile forms, everything began to change. The shift was quiet at first. There was no sudden transformation that could be seen across the land. No moment where the world itself appeared different. But within human life, within the way people connected, understood, and shared their experiences, something profound had begun. For the first time, humans could share ideas with greater clarity. Thoughts that had once been trapped inside the mind could now begin to take shape in sound. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to make a difference. A meaningful difference. Before words, communication depended heavily on what could be seen in the moment. A gesture could point to something nearby. A sound could warn of immediate danger. But now, with the earliest forms of words, humans could begin to describe things that were not directly in front of them. They could speak of a place beyond the horizon, a river that lay far away, a valley where animals had once been found. This ability changed the way knowledge moved through a group. Information was no longer limited to what could be shown. It could now be described, shared across distance, even if only in a simple form. Humans could begin to plan, not just react, not just respond to what was happening in the present moment, but think ahead and communicate those thoughts to others. A group preparing for a hunt could begin to organize before setting out. Even with a limited set of words, they could signal direction, timing, and intention. Where to go, when to move, what to expect. This made cooperation more effective, more precise, more powerful. Instead of acting individually or relying only on observation, humans could act together with shared purpose. Coordination became stronger. Actions became more aligned. And as a result, survival itself became more reliable. Teaching also began to change. Before language, learning depended mostly on observation and imitation. A child would watch an elder, repeat their actions, learn slowly through experience. But with words, even in simple forms, knowledge could be passed more directly. An elder could explain, not just show. They could guide attention, emphasize certain details, warn about dangers that were not immediately visible. Mistakes that might otherwise take years to understand could now be explained in moments. This made learning faster, more efficient, more accurate, and as knowledge passed from one generation to the next, it began to accumulate in new ways. Each generation could build upon what came before, not just by watching, but by understanding. Stories, too, began to take on a new form. Before language, stories may have existed through gesture, expression, and shared memory. But they were limited, difficult to preserve in detail, difficult to pass on with precision. With words, stories could begin to live in sound. Structured, repeatable, recognizable. A person could describe something that had already happened. A past event, a successful hunt, a dangerous encounter, a journey through unknown land. These stories carried more than entertainment. They carried knowledge, lessons, warnings, guidance. And as they were told and retold, they began to form a shared understanding of the world. The first conversations were likely simple, focused on immediate needs. A word for food, a word for movement, a word for danger. But even in their simplicity, they represented something entirely new. A connection between minds that went beyond instinct. A way to align thoughts, not just actions. A way to share not just what is seen, but what is understood. These early conversations may have been quiet, almost unremarkable to those experiencing them, but they opened a door that had never existed before in the history of life. A door into shared thought. Once that door was opened, it could never be closed again. Because language does not only allow us to speak, it allows us to think together, to build ideas collectively, to create something larger than any single mind. From these early, simple exchanges, something greater began to grow. A network of understanding. A shared reality shaped not only by what individuals experienced, but by what they could communicate. And over time, this would lead to everything that followed. Knowledge passed across generations. Ideas expanding and evolving. Cultures forming. Civilizations rising. But it all began here, with the first words. The first simple conversations. Quiet, brief, and practical. Yet powerful enough to change the course of human history forever. Language did more than improve survival. It did more than make hunting easier, or gathering more efficient, or communication clearer. It reached deeper than that. It transformed the human mind itself. Before language, thoughts existed, but they were often tied closely to the present moment. To what could be seen, to what could be touched, to what could be immediately experienced. But with the arrival of words, something new became possible. Humans could now think in ways that were not limited by what was directly in front of them. A thought could be shaped, held, and explored through language. Words gave structure to the mind. They allowed ideas to take form, to become clearer, more defined. Instead of vague impressions or fleeting images, thoughts could now be organized, connected, expanded. With words, humans could imagine things that did not yet exist. They could picture a place they had never seen, a tool that had not yet been created, a plan that had not yet been carried out. Imagination became more than a passing image. It became something that could be described, shared, refined. One person could imagine something, and through language, another could understand it. This was a powerful shift, because it meant that ideas were no longer limited to a single mind. They could move between people. They could grow. they could evolve. Language also allowed humans to reach into the past, to describe events that had already happened. Before words, memory was personal, private, difficult to fully share. But now, experiences could be retold. A hunt from days ago, a journey across distant land, a mistake that led to danger. These could now be described in a way that others could understand. The past could be carried forward, preserved not just in memory, but in shared understanding. At the same time, language opened a path into the future. Humans could now speculate. They could think about what might happen. They could consider possibilities, make plans, discuss outcomes. Even simple words allowed for this shift. A group could talk about where they might go next, what they might do tomorrow, how they might prepare for changes in the environment. The future, once uncertain and unspoken, could now be explored through thought and conversation. Language also gave rise to something deeply human, the creation of myths. Stories that went beyond simple descriptions of real events. Stories that explained the world. Why the sun rises and sets. Why storms appear. Why certain animals behave the way they do. These early myths may not have been scientifically accurate, but they served an important purpose. They helped humans make sense of their surroundings. They provided meaning. They connected experience with imagination. Storytelling itself became a powerful tool. With words, humans could tell stories not just through gesture, but through structured sound. Stories could have beginnings, middles, endings. They could carry lessons, emotions, ideas. A story could travel from one person to another, from one generation to the next. And with each telling, it could change, adapt, and grow. Language allowed humans to explain the world around them, to name things, to categorize them, to understand relationships between objects, events, and ideas. A plant was no longer just something seen. It could be named, described, remembered. Its uses could be explained. Its dangers could be shared. This made knowledge more stable, more transferable, more enduring. But perhaps the most important transformation of all was this. Language connected minds together. Before language, each human mind existed largely on its own. Thoughts were private, difficult to share fully. But with words, minds could connect. Ideas could move between individuals. Understanding could be shared, built upon, expanded. A group of humans was no longer just a collection of individuals. It became something more, a network of shared thought, a collective awareness, something larger than any single person. Through language, humans began to create a shared understanding of reality. Not just what was seen, but what was believed, what was remembered, what was imagined. This shared understanding allowed for cooperation on a level never before possible. It allowed for culture to form, for traditions to emerge, for knowledge to accumulate across generations. And all of this began with something simple: words. Sounds shaped with intention, carrying meaning from one mind to another. From that beginning, the human experience was forever changed. Because language is not just a tool we use. It is a part of how we think, how we understand, how we exist in the world. And in that quiet moment when language first began, the human mind stepped into something entirely new. A world not limited by the present, but open to the past, the future, and everything that could be imagined in between. The birth of language was not loud. It did not arrive with a sudden sound that echoed across the land. There was no single moment when the world changed all at once. No instant where silence was replaced by speech. No clear line dividing what came before and what followed after. Instead, it was something far more subtle. A quiet revolution. One that unfolded slowly, patiently, across immense stretches of time. It did not belong to a single person, or a single place, or a single generation. It belonged to all of humanity, across thousands upon thousands of years, generation by generation. Each group of humans inheriting small changes from those who came before them, each adding something new even if they were not aware of it. A slightly clearer sound, a more consistent pattern, a stronger connection between a sound and its meaning. These changes were small, almost unnoticeable, but they accumulated, like drops of water slowly shaping stone, like footsteps gradually forming a path. Sound by sound, a noise repeated, recognized, understood, and then repeated again. Over time, these sounds began to form patterns, and those patterns began to carry meaning. At first, the changes were fragile, unstable. A sound might mean one thing in one moment and something slightly different in another. But as generations passed, consistency began to emerge. The same sounds were used in similar situations. Understanding became quicker, more reliable, more natural. The connection between sound and meaning grew stronger. What had once been uncertain began to take shape. And still, the world itself did not appear to change. The forests remained. The rivers continued to flow. The animals moved across the land as they always had. But within the human experience, something was shifting. Something powerful. Something that would eventually reshape the entire course of human history. There was no celebration. No recognition that something extraordinary was happening. Because for those living through it, it felt natural. It felt like a continuation of what had always been. And yet, step by step, something entirely new was forming. Humans were no longer relying only on gesture, no longer depending solely on movement, expression, and instinctive sound. They were beginning to speak, at first in simple ways. Short sounds, basic meanings, limited expressions. But even these early forms of speech carried a new kind of power. They allowed thoughts to move more freely, to travel from one mind to another with greater clarity. And as this ability grew, so did its impact. Communication became deeper, more precise, more flexible. Humans could share not only what they saw, but what they understood. They could describe, explain, suggest, imagine. Over time, speech became more than just a tool for survival. It became a way to connect, to share experiences, to build relationships, to create a sense of belonging within a group. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the role of the human voice expanded. What had once been a simple sound became something richer, something capable of carrying emotion, meaning, identity, and eventually stories. Humans became storytellers. They could describe events that had already happened, moments from the past, experiences filled with detail and meaning. These stories could be shared again and again, passed from one person to another, from one generation to the next. And with each telling, they became part of something larger, a shared memory, a collective understanding of the world. But language did not only connect people through stories, it connected them through thought itself. Ideas could now move between minds. One person's understanding could become another's. Knowledge could grow not just within individuals, but within groups. Humans became thinkers connected by words. Not isolated minds, but parts of a larger network of understanding. A community not only of bodies, but of ideas. This transformation was quiet. There was no moment when humans suddenly realized what they had become. No instant of awareness that they had crossed a threshold. But they had. They had moved from silence into speech, from isolated thought into shared understanding, from simple communication into something far more powerful. And once this change had taken place, there was no turning back. Because language, once it begins, continues to grow. It evolves, expands, deepens, carrying humanity forward into new ways of thinking, new ways of connecting, and new ways of understanding the world. And all of it began not with a single voice, but with countless small sounds, spoken, repeated, and understood, until one day, without anyone noticing the exact moment, Humans were no longer silent beings communicating through gestures alone. They were speakers, storytellers, and thinkers connected by words. And from those first fragile sounds, something remarkable began to unfold. At first, they were simple. Soft noises carried through the air. Short calls. Small signals shared between individuals. A sound to warn of danger. A sound to call others closer. A sound to express fear, or comfort, or recognition. These earliest forms of communication were not yet language as we understand it today. They were raw, incomplete, but they carried meaning, and that meaning was enough. Over time, those small sounds began to change. Very slowly, across thousands of years, they grew. A single sound became many. Simple calls became patterns. Patterns became shared understanding. And within those patterns, something new began to take shape. Communication became more precise, more expressive, more human. Instead of only warning or signaling, early humans could begin to share more complex ideas. They could indicate not just danger, but where it was. Not just food, but how to find it. Not just emotion, but intention. A gesture combined with a sound. A repeated tone connected to an action. Gradually, these combinations formed the earliest building blocks of language. It did not happen quickly. There was no single moment when language suddenly appeared. Instead, it emerged quietly, step by step, generation after generation. Children learned the sounds of their group. They repeated them. They refined them. And sometimes they changed them. Over long periods of time, these small changes accumulated. Sounds became symbols. And symbols began to represent the world itself. A sound could now stand for an animal. Another for water. Another for movement, or direction, or time. With each passing generation, communication became more detailed, more structured, more powerful. And as language grew, so did the human mind. Because language did more than allow people to communicate. It allowed them to think differently, to organize their thoughts, to imagine things that were not immediately present, to describe the past, to plan for the future, to share ideas that could not be seen or touched. Around fires at night, language transformed simple gatherings into something deeper. Stories began to take shape, not just short descriptions of events, but extended narratives. A hunter could describe a journey that lasted days. An elder could explain lessons learned many years before. A parent could pass knowledge to a child using words that carried meaning far beyond gestures. Through language, memory became stronger. Knowledge became more stable. It no longer depended only on observation. It could now be spoken, repeated, and preserved. And as this ability strengthened, something even greater began to emerge. Shared understanding. Entire groups could now think together, plan together, imagine together. Language connected minds. It created a bridge between individuals. A way to transfer ideas from one person to another with increasing clarity. And over many thousands of years, this growing system of communication continued to evolve. It became richer, more flexible, more expressive than anything that had come before. Eventually, much later, it would give rise to something extraordinary. The ability to record ideas outside the human mind. Marks carved into stone. Symbols painted on walls. Shapes drawn onto surfaces. The earliest forms of writing. Through writing, knowledge could finally outlive the people who created it. A story no longer needed to be remembered perfectly. It could be recorded, preserved, carried forward across generations without fading. And from that moment onward, human progress began to accelerate. Ideas could travel farther, last longer, build upon one another. Civilizations would rise from these foundations. Entire societies built not only on survival, but on shared knowledge, shared beliefs, shared stories. But tonight, we do not go that far. We remain in that earlier time, a quieter time, a slower world, A world where language was still new, still forming, still fragile. There were no written symbols yet, no carved records, no preserved texts, only voices, human voices carrying meaning across the air, each word shaped by breath, each sound shaped by intention. In that world, silence had once been dominant, broken only by the sounds of nature, wind moving through trees, water flowing over stone, animals calling across the land. But now, something had changed. Human voices had begun to fill that silence. Not constantly, not loudly, but steadily. And with each shared sound, each exchanged idea, silence began to fade, replaced by something entirely new. A growing network of meaning, a shared understanding that connected individuals into something greater than themselves. And in those quiet moments, perhaps around a small fire beneath a sky full of stars, the first true conversations began. Simple, slow, but powerful, because within them, carried gently through the night air, was the beginning of one of humanity's greatest creations, language, and with it, the long story of human thought, culture, and civilization had quietly begun.